Welcome to the podcast. We're going to be talking about crime and punishment today. Specifically, I'm doing a bit of a Kantian reading of Crime and Punishment. Okay. In 1866, Fyodor Dostoyevsky published just one of his many acclaimed works, Crime and Punishment. It's a long story, one I don't have time to cover in its entirety, but I'll provide the cliff notes necessary to understand what I'm talking about. The first character to familiarize ourselves with is Raskolnikov. He's arrogant, he's sensitive, and he's a murderer. He's also one of the best written protagonists I've ever seen, but as this isn't a review, I'll keep my praise short. Anyway, Raskolnikov, or Rodia as he's sometimes called, plots and commits the murder of an old pawnbroker woman, for which he spends the whole story constantly racked with fear. He falls in love with a prostitute, gets snippy with his family, and eventually confesses his crimes to the police. I'm leaving out quite a lot, but these are the brass tacks. So the biggest part of the novel that I'm skipping over is the commitment to human pacing. We spend every single day with Rodia from start to finish, and basically never skipping any hours in which he's up and moving. This leads to Crime and Punishment being an around 650-page novel, depending on the edition and translation. In those pages, 522 in my copy, overt discussion of the philosophy behind punishment and the crimes that bring them about doesn't occur until nearly page 246, about halfway through the novel. However, this delay exemplifies a single distinction we must make. There is a difference between the social commentary that the characters portray and the ones Dostoyevsky portrays. To see what I mean, I'll supply some definitions. The world within the bounds of the narrative is called the diegesis. This solely involves things the characters can see, touch, smell, think, say, and other phenomena that they involve themselves in. Exegesis is whatever escapes that purview, say comments by the narrator or structural choices that indicate the purpose of certain narrative choices. Saying that Raskolnikov murders the woman for her money due to his delusions of grandeur is diegetic. Characters say this, they think this, and it pertains to their world. Saying that Raskolnikov's punishment is an inherent byproduct of his behavior is a reading of the text that extends past the words as written, thus being exegetical. Raskolnikov is a published social philosopher during the events of Crime and Punishment, though his impact is notably small. He was published as a last-minute addition to his university's press before a merger, and right as he left his position there. This paper of his is never shared in its entirety, but the central theme is one of an Ubermenchian ideal. He claims that certain exceptional people exist to violate common law in an effort to bring about the future, across pages 249 to about 256. Rodia is questioned in this, and his defenses are as follows. 1. He invokes the image of the Ubermensch, or the panergic man, an archetype of person, typically men, who are seen as great changers that influence their eras. He names Napoleon as a chief example. Number 2, people are divided into either extraordinary or ordinary, and they both have parts to play. The commoner upholds the law and acts indistinctly as a cog in the social machine, whereas the changer exists to buck the old world and assist in ushering in a new one. Number 3, he claims that this is simply social order as he sees it, not a way things necessarily should be. However, he also does not seem opposed to it. We never get enough of an idea of his beliefs to fully understand the idea, but the picture it paints is one of moral superiority, in which one person has more worth than others insofar as they are exceptional. To quote Raskolnikov himself, an exceptional person would have the right, he would even be obliged to remove these 10 men or these 100 men so he could make his discoveries known to all mankind. And when I say remove, I mean kill. This skews from crime to the territory of ethics, but he still supposes that it is the duty of the exceptional to break the law when the law prohibits humanity's possible growth. Which brings me to the enemy of utilitarians everywhere, Immanuel Kant. Kant rejects this wholesale in a kind of detraction that feels written into Crime and Punishment intentionally. In Kant's The Penal Law and the Law of Pardon, he writes two separate attacks on Raskolnikov. First, that man should never be used as a means to gain something or to accomplish a goal, Raskolnikov's very basis of thought is immediately rejected by Kant on the grounds of retributivist punishment. Commanding or engaging in the murder of others for some goal or change or future benefit is precisely the kind of criminal behavior Kant sought to denounce with this passage. Second, Kant argues that legal justice is practically holy, and this point in itself is two-pronged. Number one, a just society is one that always punishes those deserving of punishment. He illustrates this by saying that allowing a murderer to live is abetting the crime, and thus accepting upon yourself the blood guilt. Therefore, to not engage in legal punishment is to be yourself a criminal. Number two, a state of nature is worse than a dead state to Kant. The dishonorable knave and the unrepentant criminal are beasts that must be removed from a just society. It is impossible to will yourself to be punished, and vices punish themselves, so the justice system acts as a kind of moral gradient upon which one's life is measured. So, Raskolnikov's argument is practically a reverse-engineered sort of utilitarian scheme designed to reject Kant and deontology. The most suspect part of this is the purely skeptical portion with little backing, the section about some people being born different. It is important to note that Raskolnikov uses the phrase, the inner right to permit his consciousness to transgress certain obstacles. This seems to indicate that Rodia believes these things to be mostly internal, and more about the criminal's own morality than an overarching social code. In fact, in the same span of pages, he also claims that this Übermensch may even feel pity or sorrow for the lives they must take, but that they permit themselves to do so anyway. Taking a step back, all of this is the diegetic stance taken by the main character. To simply elaborate on his story, Rodia believes that he should be one of these exceptions. However, what the protagonist believes and what the author wishes to say come to head the moment Raskolnikov carries out his murder. Raskolnikov is hounded both by his own psyche and by the police for several days, possibly a week or more, until he eventually crumbles under the pressure of his own guilt. Raskolnikov, it turns out, was no exception to human decency. What is Dostoyevsky actually trying to say then? Does he agree with Kant? Does he agree with Raskolnikov? Or does he believe in some tertiary, more interesting option? Well, unfortunately, he mostly believes in Kant, but we do get to speculate a bit and have some fun based on his narrative. It is blatant by the inner turmoil Rodia suffers that he is not an anti-hero or any form of a good person due to these murders. Dostoyevsky makes no effort to push Rodia's theories. Another character who expresses certain anti-Kantian feelings is Porfiry, the investigator who is after Rodia most of the novel. To quote Porfiry, "Do you know what they mean," he asks Raskolnikov, "when they talk of taking suffering upon themselves? They don't mean suffering for anybody in particular, just got to go do some suffering. That means accept suffering, and if it's from the authorities, so much the better." End quote. Despite the fact that this character is naturally opposed to Raskolnikov as a police officer and morally opposed to his theories, we may be led to believe that his beliefs are closer to Kant, but no. I believe here is where we first see how Dostoyevsky differs from Kant in a particularly metaphysical way. Kant blatantly says, "It is impossible to will to be punished." To fully interrogate this point, let me draw us to one of my favorite scenes of the novel, just before the epilogue. Raskolnikov is traveling to confess his crime at the behest and with the support of his partner, Dunya. Before he can do it, he breaks down and offers a solid critique of rehabilitativist punishment. Quote, "What for? What will I be able to realize better than I do now after 20 years of hard labor, crushed by suffering and idiocy, when I'm senile and impotent? What will there be left to live for? Why should I consent to live like that? Oh, when I stood over the Neva at dawn today, I knew I was vile." End quote. Here, he challenges the idea that the suffering the law demands will teach him anything, as he already understands how wicked he is. However, after he is taken to prison, well, nothing really changes at first. All at once, though, one evening in prison while Dunya visits him, he just snaps into place as if he was supposed to be a certain way all along and had been denied it. In the end, it isn't brutal punishment that saves him, or loving punishment, or any punishment at all, but the love of his partner. Human compassion is the savior. As beautiful as that scene is to end out Raskolnikov's story, it doesn't answer our questions about Kant. So is Dostoyevsky a Kantian? Mostly yes, but with a side of no. See, love is ultimately what allows Raskolnikov to change, but he would never have valued such love without his suffering. Dostoyevsky does still seem to value the integral Kantian point of suffering for the sake of a universal slight. However, Crime and Punishment takes Kant's social and legal point and makes it more spiritual or overtly metaphysical. What I mean by this is the difference between what suffering is meant to do for a person. Kant believes that punishment must follow crime as assuredly as thunder follows lightning in order to maintain social honor. Dostoyevsky posits that our world is one in which, yes, punishment follows crime and must do so, but as a law of nature. The amends made by suffering are almost supernatural, to the point that one just happens into propriety one day as if by a miracle. Instead of upholding some social promise or order, crime begets in people a desire for punishment, one which taints their mind and soul until they willingly accept their suffering, as though it were a cleansing ritual.